The following video will not replace site-specific training, but it will provide a general overview of the changes in Hazard Communication Standard. Training specific to your workplace will still be necessary.
Thank you for taking a few minutes to sit down and watch this informational video about the important changes that OSHA and the state of Maine have adopted regarding Hazard Communication Standard. These changes are aimed at aligning our workforce with the United Nations globally harmonized system of the classification and labeling on chemicals. Note that the acronym GHS is used throughout this video and in much of the OSHA documentation. You will also see HCS used in place of Hazard Communication Standard. Coming up, we will discuss in detail the more notable changes focusing on what information will be required on labels, including product identifiers, signal words, hazard statements, precautionary statements, supplier information, and pictograms. We will also focus on the changes to the safety data sheets that accompany hazardous chemicals. But first, let's talk about why these standards are going into effect and what benefit they will have for you. In a nutshell, the HCS, as written in 1983, gave workers a right to know what they were handling, but the new globally harmonized system gives workers the right to understand them. In the past, manufacturers had to evaluate any chemicals they produced or imported, and although they had to label them displaying hazard information, they were allowed to convey that information in any way they chose. Under the new GHS system, a single set of standards has been created to classify chemicals based on their health and physical hazard. It will also standardize the hazard communication elements and the safety data sheets that are created for chemicals. How big a deal is this? Well, in the United States alone, this new standard will cover more than 43 million workers who produce or handle hazardous material in more than 5 million different workplaces. The GHS rulemaking is the result of more than 2 decades of international negotiation and national discussion aimed at creating one worldwide standard for the classification and labeling of hazardous chemicals in the workplace. Its sole purpose is to make the employee safer. First, the new labeling standards. All manufacturers and importers must evaluate the chemicals that they produce in their workplace or import and classify them in accordance to this section. Let's start by looking at what the requirements are for these labels and how you can read them, and then we can take a look at how they will appear. The product identifier is how the hazardous chemical is identified. This can be, but is not limited to, the chemical name, code number, or batch number. The manufacturer, importer, or distributor can decide the appropriate product identifier. The same product identifier must be on both the label and in Section 1 of the safety data sheet, which we will discuss later. The signal words are used to indicate the relative level of severity of the hazard and alert the reader to a potential hazard on the label. There are only 2 words used as signal words: danger and warning. Within a specific hazard class, danger is used for the more severe hazards and warning is used for the less severe hazards. There will only be 1 signal word on the label, no matter how many hazards a chemical may have. This is important to remember. So if you are handling a container that has multiple hazards in it, even though both will be identified on the label, if one of the hazards warrants a danger signal word and another warrants the signal word warning, then only danger should appear on the label. Hazard statements describe the nature of the hazard or hazards of a chemical, including, where appropriate, the degree of hazard. An example might be, causes damage to kidneys through prolonged or repeated exposure when absorbed through the skin. Or, if there were multiple statements, highly flammable liquid and vapor may cause liver and kidney damage. All of the applicable hazard statements must appear on the label. Precautionary statements describe recommended measures that should be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects resulting from exposure to the hazardous chemical or improper storage or handling. There are 4 types of precautionary statements: prevention, to minimize exposure; response, in case of accidental spillage or exposure; storage; and disposal. An example might be, do not breathe dust, fume, gas, mist, vapors, or spray. Get medical advice or attention if you feel unwell. Store at room temperature. Dispose of contents or container in accordance with local, regional, national, and international regulations. A / designates that the classifier can choose one of the precautionary statements. Supplier information includes name, address, and telephone number of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. Pictograms are graphic symbols used to communicate specific information about the hazards of a chemical. The required pictograms consist of a red square frame set at a point with a black hazard symbol on a white background, sufficiently large enough to be clearly visible. A red square frame set at a point without a hazard symbol is not a pictogram and is not permitted on the label. Let's look at the 9 pictograms that the GHS will be using. The first symbol represents a health hazard, and its dangers include carcinogens, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, respiratory sensitizers, target organ toxicity, and aspiration toxicity. Next is the flame symbol, and its hazards include flammables, pyrophorics, self-heating, the possibility of emitting a flammable gas, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. Then we have the exclamation mark icon. Its hazards are skin and eye irritants, skin sensitizers, acute toxicity that is harmful, narcotic effects, respiratory tract irritants, and things that are hazardous to the ozone layer. This last one is a non-mandatory reason to add the symbol. Next is the gas cylinder pictogram. This symbol means that there are gases under pressure in the container. After that, we have the corrosion image. The perils of this symbol include skin corrosion or burns, eye damage, and that it could be corrosive to metals. Following corrosion is the exploding bomb representation. Its hazards are explosives, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. Then we come to the pictogram that shows a flame over a circle. The danger here is of oxidizers. The skull and crossbones icon is next, and in this case it stands for acute toxicity that is fatal or toxic. And finally, we have the environment symbol, which is the only non-mandatory pictogram in the group. It signifies aquatic toxicity. Now that we have looked at the types of information on the label and examined what all of the pictograms symbolize, let's look at a couple of examples of labels that fit into the new global harmonization system and see if we can identify all of the parts. Remember, the layout of the label might be a little different from product to product, but the information should be consistent. Our first example is a sample that does not have all of the information for the made-up product, but does have areas to point out where that information would be. This makes it a little easier to find things for our first illustration. The product identifier would have a code and product name here. The supplier identification will at the very least include the name, address, and telephone number for the company who manufactured the product. Next, we have the precautionary statement, which, as we covered earlier, can include 4 types of information: prevention, response, storage, and disposal. Then the pictograms that are associated with this hazard. Here we see health hazard and flame. Beneath that is the signal word associated with this label. Here we see that this product has been labeled with the danger identifier. Remember that there were only 2 possible signal words that a label can have: warning and danger. And of the two, danger is the one that poses a higher risk to the individual that handles the container. Then we have the hazard statement for this label, which details the dangers associated with the container. Finally, we can see that this label also has supplemental information. This was not covered earlier when we discussed the sections of the label because it is not required and may not be found on some labels. It is, however, a way for the label producer to provide additional information that it deems helpful. That was one sample label. Now let's look at another one. This one with a different layout and with all the information filled in. The different categories might be a little harder to identify, but let's try. Let's try this one a little different. I will tell you what you were looking for and give you a second to look for it before it is highlighted on the screen. First, can you see the signal word? Here it is. We can see that this label has been marked with a warning identifier. Now can you point out the supplier identification? That one was a little tricky, as it is at the bottom of this label and was near the top of the first one we saw. Next, see if you can locate the hazard statement. It is just this simple statement here, harmful if swallowed. Which pictogram does this label display? Right, the exclamation mark. Do you recall the perils associated with this one? Here they are: skin and eye irritants, skin sensitizers, acute toxicity that is harmful, narcotic effects, respiratory tract irritants, and things that are hazardous to the ozone layer. So we know one of these hazards is in the container we are examining. Okay, back to the label. Let's try pointing out the product identifier. Looks like we are dealing with bad stuff cleaner and that the batch number is listed below it. Finally, can you see the precautionary statement? Correct. It's everything that is left on the label. If you had no problem finding the proper information on that label, then you did an excellent job. If it still seemed a bit confusing, don't worry too much. This was only your second time seeing the format. However, you may want to go back and review the first part of this video again if you feel like you are still not sure what you were looking at when you see a label like this. The Hazard Communication Standard, revised in 2012, requires that the chemical manufacturer, distributor, or importer provide safety data sheets, which are often referred to as SDSs and were formerly known as Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDSs, for each hazardous chemical to downstream users to communicate information on these hazards. Most of the information that is in the new format is the same as what you saw in the MSDSs. However, the big change is that the safety data sheets will now require that information is presented in a consistent, more user-friendly format. This format consists of 16 sections, requires that they are numbered, and that the headers for each are listed on every card. This means whether the SDS is written in Paris, France, or in Paris, Maine, those 16 sections will be the same, so that workers who are familiar with where information is listed in the safety data sheet will be able to easily decipher it. The bottom line is that the new SDSs will be more user-friendly and easier to understand. Section 1 is identification, and it includes the product identifier, manufacturer or distributor's name, address, phone number, emergency phone number, recommended use, and restrictions on use. Section 2 explains hazard identifications, and this includes all hazards regarding the chemical and required label elements. Section 3 is for composition and/or information on ingredients, and it includes information on chemical ingredients and trade secret claims. Section 4 displays first aid measures and includes important symptoms and/or effects that might arise, whether acute or delayed, and it states required treatment. Section 5 relates to firefighting measures and lists suitable extinguishing techniques, equipment, and chemical hazards that can arise when the chemical burns. Section 6 is about accidental release measures, and it lists emergency procedures, the protective equipment that might be required, the proper methods of containment, and the suggested methods of cleanup. Section 7 explains handling and storage, and it lists precautions for safe handling and storage of the chemical, and it includes storage incompatibilities. Section 8 displays exposure controls and/or personal protection, and it lists OSHA's permissible exposure limits for the hazardous substance. It also includes the threshold limit values, the appropriate engineering controls, and the personal protective equipment that is suggested for dealing with the chemical. Well, we are halfway through the safety data sheet, and it is worth noting at this point that the previous sections, numbers 1 through 8, contain general information about the chemical, its identification, any hazards, its composition, required safe handling practices, and emergency control measures, like firefighting. This material should be helpful to those that need to get the information quickly. Going forward, Sections 9 through 11, along with Section 16, contain other technical and scientific information. The SDS must also contain Sections 12 through 15 to be consistent with the new globally harmonized system. But OSHA will not enforce the content of these sections because they concern matters handled by other agencies. Section 9 relates to the physical and chemical properties, and it lists the chemical's characteristics. Next, Section 10 explains the stability and reactivity of the chemical as it lists the possibility of hazardous reactions for the substance. Section 11 displays toxicological information and includes routes of exposure such as inhalation, ingestion, and skin or eye contact. It also explains related symptoms, whether they have acute or chronic effects, and the numerical measures of toxicity that the substance has. Section 12 covers ecological information, and it provides information to evaluate the environmental impact of the chemical if it were released into the environment. Section 13 states the disposal considerations and gives guidance on proper disposal practices, recycling or reclamation of the chemicals or their containers, and any other safe handling practices. Section 14 examines transport information and includes guidance on classification information for shipping and transporting of hazardous chemicals by road, air, rail, or sea. Section 15 is about regulatory information. This section identifies the safety, health, and environmental regulations specific for the product that is not indicated anywhere else on the SDS, including information from other regulatory bodies such as OSHA, the Department of Transportation, Environmental Protection Agency, or Consumer Product Safety Commission. And Section 16 covers any other information, and it includes the date of preparation for the SDS or when the last revision was made. It might also include any other useful information that has not been included yet. Wow, it sounds like a lot. But remember that this was all information that was being covered before. It is now just being organized in a way that will be easier to read and use. You might start seeing safety data sheets that look like this right now, as the format has been released as an option for manufacturers and distributors. But in the very near future, the optional part will come out of that, and you will see one of these for every chemical container that you handle. Before we get to the timeline of when these changes will start to appear in your workplace, there is another change that will affect you as an employee. Up until now, when you use the HMIS, or Hazardous Materials Identification System, there was a numerical number assigned that represented the level of danger associated with that substance, and that system used a scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being the least hazardous and 4 being the most dangerous. The GHS system will also incorporate a scaling system, and it too will use the numbers 1 through 4. However, under the global harmonization system, 1 will now represent the most severe hazards, and chemicals marked with a 4 will hold the least amount of danger. All of these things are really big changes, especially when implementing them to so many companies. But things are going to move fairly quickly. The timeline for these changes looks like this. As of December 2013, employees must be trained on the new label elements and the SDS format. By June of 2015, all manufacturers must comply with the provisions of this new hazard communication standard. But they will be allowed to ship previously made products up until December 2015. Which means that all new hazardous chemicals shipped after June 1st, 2015 will have the specific elements, the signal word, and pictograms we covered in part 1 of this video, along with the SDS that is set up in the 16 sections we discussed in part 2. And we should also note that by June 2016, all alternative workplace labeling and hazard communication programs will need to be updated as well. There should be a consideration for any additional employee training for any newly identified physical or health hazards. As employees, you should find that safety data sheets are readily accessible for all hazardous chemicals in your workplace, whether kept in a binder or in a computer that is open for access to everyone. In fact, employers must keep a written program describing how the rules will be implemented, including a list of hazardous chemicals and methods for informing employees about related non-routine tasks. Employers must make sure that this program is kept current when these new provisions are implemented. For instance, updating the list of hazardous chemicals when needed. It is important to remember that this video is a support tool to help you better understand the overall changes to the labeling system and the safety data sheets GHS and OSHA has mandated. But it is not specific to your individual workplace, and you will still need site-specific training. If you have any questions, there are a lot of resources available on the OSHA.gov website, including examples of safety data sheets, new GHS labels, and the pictograms that will be on them. Thank you for watching this video. We hope that it has helped prepare you for the coming hazard communication changes. Please take a second and pause the playback when the next screen comes up with 3 questions, and then see if you can answer each one correctly, just to make sure you are comfortable with the new GHS standards. Hopefully you saw that all 3 answers were false. If not, you might want to consider watching this video again or reading more about the GHS changes that are coming. Again, thank you for taking the time to watch this video.